Okay, again, thank you, Adolfo and Sage, and all of you at For Amor. Events once again have overtaken us in this scheduled event. Uh, Today, the Biden administration announced sanctions against Cuba, new sanctions. But I'm going to back up a minute for those of you, to just give you a little overview how we got to today. And let's begin July 11th in Cuba. We saw historic, unprecedented protests. Now, what was historic and unprecedented about it is they seem to have erupted around 40 cities or towns, pueblos, whatever, big and small, throughout the island, from one end of the island to the other. Let me give you a little perspective on that. Protesting in Cuba is not easy. Repercussions are generally pretty swift and fast. I happened to be there for the 1994, what became known as the Balsero crisis or the Malaconazo. And what happened in 94, it was the height of what's called the special period, one of the great euphemisms in history, nothing special about it, except hunger, where people raced, to the Malecon, but also all the shore, wherever people could get boats. And there was a mass migration. I will promise you that in the back of President Biden's mind and everybody in the administration is, we don't want that. We don't want, once again, we don't want a lot of small boats. Balsos mean boats. And we don't want Marielle. So that is probably the number one factor going on in the Biden administration. The second factor going on for them is Florida, Miami, Democrats, etc., and the election next year. I want to again go back to what these unique protests. So why did thousands and thousands of Cubans take to the streets? Again, what's remarkable is there was no coordinated leader. There's not one person, there was no coordination. You have YouTube, you have iPhones, but the internet in Cuba, as many of you know, is very dicey and iffy. And also it can be shut down, which it was eventually depending on who's using it and how the government responds. Now, how serious were these protests? Very. How do we know that? Because Raul Castro, who had retired for good, he's 90 years old, showed up, I'm told, at a meeting of the Partido, the Communist Party, and then he went to a rally, a pro-government rally. That's a real big deal. That's an indicator, because remember, there's not 40 broadsheets and newspapers on the island. So this truly rattled the Cuban government. And after that, after Raul Castro appeared and did what he, put his foot down, basically, we saw a roundup. Many, many people were arrested. We don't know the exact number, whether it's hundreds or thousands, we don't know. For those of you who know the performance artist Tanya Bruguera, she had already been under house arrest and she was kind of chronicling things. But then what we do know is she was taken away. She said, we know that, at least the last account I saw was that she's at Villa Marista. Villa Marista is a prison in Havana that you don't want to be in. It's also known as the pressure cooker. Now, let me jump now to Miami. So this historic, unprecedented demonstrations began. And by the way, what are the root causes? We have hunger. What people on the street said is that just sheer hunger and the COVID situation, regardless of their vaccines. Maybe there's Cubans who don't quite trust the vaccine. We know that there's several 100,000 cases, but we don't have peer-reviewed outside information on that. Yes, it is very true that the Cuban government has always been very good with epidemics, pandemics, for instance, dengue fever, and they move very aggressively. But COVID is a big factor, and hunger. And the other thing you need to observe is that look at the people who demonstrated July 11th, July 12th. They don't look like old elite Cubans. Most of them are mixed race, or we say mulatto in Cuba. They're not old white elite men. They are people of color predominantly on the street. So this protest movement in the 40 cities and towns encompassed all economic classes, all races, etc. Okay, now, predictably, everything with Cuba, people run to their predictable corners, their political corners. And Miami did not disappoint. And immediately in Miami, we heard some pretty hyper-inflated rhetoric. First of all, there was massive protests in Miami. And the governor, Ron DeSantis, had just passed a bill called to stop what he said were rioting and protests. And literally in this bill, if you blocked a public road or anything like that, this bill allowed vehicles and cars and anybody wanting to go anywhere to literally run you over. However, when Cuban exiles took to the streets, they shut down literally the Palmetto Expressway. Now that's a big deal. Was that law invoked? No, it was not invoked. And there's a pretty terrific column by Fabiola Santiago in the Miami Herald about why wasn't the recently passed Governor DeSantis anti-riot, anti-protest bill, why wasn't it shut down? And then the question she asks is, well, maybe it's only meant for people of color, for Black Lives Matter, or just Democrats or whatever. But there have been mass demonstrations. They continue to go on in South Florida. And but there has been no reaction to those demonstrators by the governor. Now, let us catch up today to the latest news. And that is that the Biden administration announced sanctions. And the sanctions that they announced are kind of along the lines of what we call the Magnitsky Act, which is what we passed involving Russia, people who had arrested and tortured and killed, Sergei Magnitsky, who was an attorney in Russia. These are pretty targeted. So they're naming individuals. And one of the people that they did name was the head of the Cuban defense minister, Alvaro Lopez Miera, and who played a very key role in, orchestrating this group that's kind of known as the Black Berets of Cuba, who rounded up people and did all the arrests. So he was specifically cited today. Obviously, Miguel Diaz-Canel and members of the Castro family. Now, who's running things? People are going to ask. Well, there's Miguel Diaz-Canel, the first non-Castro, who's basically the formal head of the government. However, he was selected by Raul Castro, and you can take it to the bank that Raul Castro, his son Alejandro Castro Espin, who's a major figure in the Cuban Armed Forces, known as the FAR, F-A-R, and his son-in-law, Lopez Calles Rodriguez. I'm sorry. This guy has 10 names, but let's just call him Lopez Calles Rodriguez. And he's more or less runs all tourism and, well, every lucrative entity on behalf of the Cuban Army in Cuba. So before the announcement was made, though, the Biden officials, you know, our new Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, it's a whole State Department cadre, did a conference call with principally Miami politicians who were Democrats. For instance, the mayor, you know, what is her name? Danielle. I don't know what happened there, but whatever. Daniela Levin Cava, Manny Diaz, who head of the Democratic Party, Joe Garcia, the former representative Debbie McCarcel Powell, etc., and also just people like from the Cuba's study group, such as Carlos Saladrigas. Okay, so I'm going to see if I can get myself back up here. Let's just say, I don't know, whatever. Okay. So before that, though, yesterday, no surprise, Sean Hannity brought his official clown show to Versailles. That's how they say Versailles in Little Havana. And he had all the Republican delegation. What was really struck me about the Sean Hannity clown show was that outside Versailles and inside were all these, whatever, Trumpistas. And they were howling and attacking Ron DeSantis, the governor, who they called a rhino. They were attacking Marco Rubio. They were attacking Maria Alvira Salazar, the former Spanish language talk show host. They were saying that they're rhinos and no good, and really had them on their back foot. So in other words, whatever those guys are doing in Florida, they're not doing enough, according to, I call them the Trumpistas, which is basically who Sean Hannity coordinates with. Now, there's been no shortage of missteps by everybody. As I said, predictably, everybody has gone to their corner, and there is no dearth of bad behavior on all sides. Let's discuss Black Lives Matter quickly. They blew it big time. They issued a statement in which they condemned the demonstrations, and they blamed everything on the U.S. embargo, which, by the way, is a very difficult condition for any country. That said, there are no restrictions on any other country. So the other 350 countries in the world can buy, sell, and trade anything they want with Cuba. So if Cuba has things going, they can do it, say, with Mexico, or the Dominican Republic has a pretty lively economy, etc. Again, the U.S. embargo is a big deal, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't prohibit any other country. So Black Lives Matter failed to see that the vast majority of the people protesting were people of color. This then caused another head-spinning reaction where Black Cubans, well, Cubans of every stripe in Cuba, in South Florida, are just livid, saying they feel betrayed by Black Lives Matter. In other words, they were more or less saying Black Lives don't matter only if if you back the Castro family. So there's been a lot of very heated rhetoric in that regard. One of my favorite, one of my favorite, is the Coral Gables mayor. His name is Vince Lago. Vince Lago is right up there with some of the great clowns. There's been a big art show going on, I guess, or a big, arts museums and various things in South Florida and Coral Gables. He banned any Cuban artist, that he feels like banning. For instance, there's, I believe her name is Sandra Ramos, and she left Cuba. She left Cuba many years ago, but he found out that somebody in her family was in the Partido, the Communist Party or something, and he banned her work, which is insane. Completely. In other words, he's saying that Cuban censorship is so bad that he has to outdo them. And not just her. So you have Vince Lago completely discrediting the policy of South Florida Cuban exile Republicans. That's pretty good. Again, on the Cuban side, Tanya Bruguera, who's a very well-known performance installation artist. Let me tell you something interesting about Tanya, who I know, and I know her mother, is Tanya's father, I think his name was Manuel Brugueras. He was kind of a big deal Cuban politician. He was this close with Fidel. Ironically, he once said that he didn't think Fidel was going to make it. And like a month or two later, he died, not Fidel. As you know, Fidel hung on for almost 10 years, really messing up the publication of my book Without Fidel. We waited 10 years before the final exit, not to get into a personal matter. Anyway, Tanya has been, I guess, as much getting the message out from the Cuban streets and saying this is not a political message. This is strictly hunger and COVID and meat and potato issues. It's not ideological. And she's now in Villa Marista, which you would not want to be in. It's, as I said, it's known in Spanish as the pressure cooker. It's where the famous General Ochoa spent his last days, as did the De La Guardias, and before execution. Let me tell you some other bad behavior. So somebody, during the Black Lives Matter protests in America, Washington, D.C., arranged or allowed a massive writing of Black Lives Matter outside where the original demonstrations were, and they remain there to this day in the very heart of Washington, D.C. When everything exploded in Cuba and Miami, and this is just script to everybody, I'm not sure who did it, but somebody did the very same thing in front of the Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C., and wrote Cuba Libre or Viva Cuba Libre, one of those, Cuba Libre. Well, today or yesterday, the mayor of Washington, D.C., who has maintained the Black Lives Matter outside the original site of protest, had Cuba Libre. It was disappeared. It was painted over. I can't tell you exactly who made the decision or how it was enforced or whatever, but again, this is causing a Twitter storm, and my job here is to bring you up on the latest. So again, Sean Hannity was down there today at Versailles, and remember Maria Elvira Salazar, who is quite a character. She hardened her position today because yesterday she was called a rhino, and hardliners outside Versailles booed them all. So she was on the air today to make sure that whoever, um, uh, whatever the Biden administration does, it won't be enough. Now, let me just tell you a few things. So Francis Suarez, who, by the way, distinguished himself around a week ago, because he gave an interview and he said he thought that the Panamanian model was not a bad idea. For those of you who don't remember, the U.S. Military under George Bush invaded Panama and forcibly removed and arrested Manuel Noriega. I think that is traditionally called an act of war. And he said that that seemed like a good idea here for Cuba. You will hear on Miami radio and everywhere else, there are many people who are saying similar comments. Now, he then walked it back a little bit. Not a whole lot, but he walked it back and just said that because of the intractability of 62 years, it might be a good idea. Today, they want the Biden administration to beam in internet because the Cuban government is, of course, cutting off internet among Cubans, which is, they've been emailing or whatever. So they, making sure no one can communicate. But that was pretty remarkable. The 40 cities suddenly protests and all over the island. But that doesn't really work. It's really hard to beam an internet unless you have a provider. And, Cuba, of course, has a monopoly on that. So some of these ideas are kind of lame, but they make good political points and, for Miami Cubans. And the last thing I will say, and I'll open this up for questions, what is running this situation? What's running this situation is politics. Joe Biden took a lot of heat for blowing Florida, for losing Florida, and carrying Miami-Dade, which you should carry by double digits if you're a Democrat, and just barely getting in with single digits. He has taken a lot of heat from Democratic politicians, many Cuban ones, for blowing South Florida and Florida. I frankly think that getting Florida, the state, to go Democrat again, owing to gerrymandering and all kinds of other situations, it's hopeless. However, he heard the Miami Democratic Cuban American exiles, and he stepped on it. So today he moved forward. But this is very much, he's finally listening. Okay, how badly did the Biden administration blow Florida during the election? Well, as many of you know, Miami and South Florida are awash with Venezuelan, Nicaraguan, and Cuban refugees or exiles. And what is the common glue? What is the common bonding? They fleeing communism. Who does the Democrats send down to campaign in Florida? Bernie Sanders, the most famous socialist in America. So tone deaf. Kamala Harris would be the wrong person. So now, as going forward, he's using as his tutor Senator Robert Menendez, of New Jersey, the senator. He's in there, and he's a Cuban American hardliner. So basically, this is being revamped. He's toughening things up. He also said today, or the administration said today, that the sanctions were just the beginning. And I think they're going to take the temperature, see how that goes. I'm not endorsing any of what they've done so far, but or even condemning it, but I'm just telling you that's what's happened, and there will be more. And at that, why don't I just open it up to questions, unless you want me to give you more history and an update on the latest news.
Go ahead.
Well, is there a question in specifically?
We have several questions. Do you want to
Okay.
just go there?
Well,
Okay.
I'm just saying is we're at an impasse now, but basically politically what Joe Biden did, he brought the temperature down for Florida Democrats, specifically Cuban Americans, which is kind of crucial. As I said, my personal analysis of covering elections and all that is I think Florida's kind of hopeless because it's been gerrymandered into a we've never seen, because the gerrymandering was conducted by Mario Diaz-Balart years ago with Marco Rubio when they were both in the state legislature. And it truly is an art form down there. So it's been, however, him winning Miami-Dade County by single digit is truly embarrassing. So because Miami-Dade County is a Democratic county. They got a Democratic governor. Do you follow? I mean, not a governor. I mean, the Democrat is the, remember there's Miami-Dade County and there's also the city of Miami. And then there's also Miami Beach. Miami Beach and the county are both run by Democrats. So to say the Democrats' fortunes have been so crushed in South Florida because missteps by the National Democratic Party, who don't get how toxic socialism, communism is. I mean, you can go down there and say, we want Medicare for all, but I think that would go over because Cuban Americans have been really help themselves to a lot of what we typically call the dole, a lot of perks and a lot of stuff, but you cannot go, you just have to be very supportive of, if you want to get elected, of the refugee exile population. And they had some catastrophic losses. Donna Shalala was the Democratic, she held the seat for Miami. She lost. She's a seasoned politician, but she was dead wrong. She lost to Maria Alvera. She doesn't speak Spanish. She's of Lebanese descent. She's a good whatever. She ran the University of Miami. That was a mistake. You cannot run candidates in Miami-Dade who aren't Spanish speakers. They don't have to necessarily be from Santiago de Cuba, but they have to be able to communicate on Spanish language radio, which, remember, is very, very important in Cuban culture. So I'll let you guys ask some questions and we'll go from there.
Okay, well, the first question that we had, and I just want everybody to know this, if we're recording this, we are recording this, and you can come to our website, maybe in 24 hours, we'll have it up, and you can take a look at the whole talk. I've got a question from, it says it's coming from me, but I think it's coming from Daryl Couturier, who's using my link. Why is it that no politician, orator, public speaker, media writer speaks about the difference between communism and socialism? There are big differences, but no one seems to equate the two.
Well, I think I partially answered that. Cuban Americans love government benefits. When they first came to America, they had every benefit. They went to the front of the immigration list. We all famously remember wet foot, dry foot. And they had special school programs, college programs, bilingual this, bilingual that other groups certainly didn't get. And so they love having the perks, as everybody does. But nobody has framed it within the Cuban American political community in South Florida. Uh, I'm just saying, when you send Bernie Sanders to Florida, you sent the wrong person, you know. Now, they have the head of the Department of Homeland Security. He's a Cuban, Alejandro Mayorkas, I think is how he says his name. That's somebody you could send who's quite credible. But I found it a little problematic that here's a guy who fled Cuba with his family, and he immediately announced, if you're going to try to flee Cuba, you're not getting here. I mean, there was a little disconnect. He could have said something like, we're sympathetic. We understand food shortages and vaccine shortages. But nobody has articulated that the US government simply wants to provide food and vaccines for the Cuban people, and just leave those words. You know, one of the problems is though many of you know, there's a famous slogan in Cuba, socialismo o muerte, you know, socialism or death, patria y muerte. Now, what is the anthem and the mantra of the new protesters? Is patria, country, y vida. It used to be, I'll translate it. It used to be a patria, a country or death. Now it's country and life. Well, that might not sound like a lot to some of you. That is a big slap in the face for many former, let's say, Castro supporters, because that was the country or death was the official slogan of the Castro family. Fidel came up with it himself. So that, and there's a song that is a co-production between Cuban rap singers in Cuba and Cuban rap singers in Miami, all of whom are Black, Cuban Blacks, and they have a song called Patria y Vida, country and life. And that has gone completely viral on the island and throughout South Florida. And my own view is there's no going back. We are at a watershed moment. We are just there. This is not going to be something that's going to be easily suppressed, because even if everybody is arrested, even if the internet is ended, everybody on the streets has a dozen family members, and this is going to have to be addressed. I think Lopez Levy, who's a Cuban American professor, who came from a prominent family in Castro, Cuba, you know, he pointed out these fundamental issues must be addressed. Now, obviously, COVID has really hurt them because it ended tourism. What's the bread and butter of Cuba? Tourism. But now, so it's really crucial that they vaccinate their whole population, and that we know that the vaccines are effective, you know. And I'm not a scientist. I can't give you, I can't evaluate that. But I hope that answer helps.
I've got another question. Ann Louise, do you see any signs of division in the Cuban government on how to handle the protest, or to make concessions or repress fiercely? In other words, do you see divisions in Cuba?
I think there are divisions. But those at the very top, the fact that Raul Castro leaves retirement, marches into a party meeting, a Communist Party meeting, and then shows up at a rally, said, I'm running this. That's what that means. And remember that Miguel Diaz-Balart is his handpicked guy, and there's just no daylight. So between the two of them, and as I pointed out, the key figures in the Cuban FAR, that's the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarios, that's the Cuban army, is called the FAR. There's a Spanish acronym. They are all Castro. They're all old generals, or there is everybody's on the same page. And the Cuban military is the most powerful political organ in Cuba, period. So that said, though, every one of them has family members, children, relatives in Cuba, and very likely in South Florida or in exile, who are telling them, fundamental change has to be made. Open up economic opportunities. Stop making us have to get 60 licenses, to run a peluqueria, which is a beauty parlor. In other words, just let everybody do their own thing at this time, because it's a crisis. And of course, those of you who have been there know that Cuba operates a great deal on the black market, and there's endless supplies falling off of government trucks. But there are divisions, and they're not stupid. The Cuban government has not stayed in power for 62 years without an election, a national election, because they're dumb and they're paying attention. And they will have to come out, or people will say there's nothing to lose. For many years, protesters and dissidents would say, no vale la pena. It's not worth it. Let's just get on a boat and go to Florida. Many of the people there, particularly Black Cubans, do not have family in Florida. You follow what I'm saying? So, and this mass arrests, and again, we don't have data. We only have anecdotal reports, is indicative that they get it. Now, there's going to be a part of them. There are going to be some hardliners who say we got to crack down, and there's already summary trials are going on in Cuba, because they have their own anti-riot Ron DeSantis law, even worse. We used to call it peligrosidad, danger. In other words, if the government thinks that you potentially pose a danger, they can arrest you preemptively. So, but I got to tell you, to take the number one performance artist really in the hemisphere, Tania Bruguera, the daughter of a well-known Cuban politician, and put her in Villa Marista, you can be sure the whole island is talking about it. So they have a lot of work to do. They got a lot of work to do in Miami and Florida. And the Biden administration has to figure out a way to go forward that doesn't starve to death the Cuban people. And I think they tried that with sanctions on people like the defense minister today. But I think
I've got a follow-up to that question. There's been reports that some of the Boinas Negras and the Black Berets and some of the other police units are changing sides, taking their uniforms off, and decided not to repress the Cuban people. Have you heard any of that?
Yes. Listen, who are the rank and file of the Cuban military? The rank and file are ordinary Cubans. And by the way, they're not doing so great. If you're just a regular, draftee in the Cuban army, or you're doing your time of national service, chances are you're not eating 3 meals a day. And then they have all their family members. There is no turning back that this is a huge watershed moment. There can be no underestimating what it means for 40 cities and towns to explode in protests. Where it goes, I think that the Biden administration is looking at this real carefully. Now, obviously, they have a lot of concerns about 2022, the election next year, and they can blow that. They would like to take back that seat from Maria Alvera that they lost, the Donna Shalala seat. They would like to bounce Jimenez, Carlos Jimenez. They took seats they should never have lost. And the South Florida Democratic Party blamed the administration for not coming in and campaigning. Remember that Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, even, they won large double digits in Miami-Dade. They carried the state, for God's sake. So Bill Clinton. So there's been a lot. Whether you can put that genie back in the bottle, I'm not sure. I don't think you can put the genie back in the bottle on Cuba. That I'm sure about. This is massive. And I think if the government of Miguel Diaz-Canel does not recognize that and just does repression, I think people are going to say we have nothing to lose.
Okay, we've gotten quite a few questions about Black Lives Matter and also about the internet. Let's deal with the internet first. First of all, do you know what the extent of the internet is now in Cuba? Is it back up?
Well, first of all, as somebody who has, made over a dozen long trips on the island, the internet on its best day in Cuba was never great. I don't know, there's La Rampa, a lot of us would have to sit, even reporters who had a news bureau would be sitting on the street trying to pick up, a connection. So I remember years ago covering something in Santa Clara and, the whole resolver, inventando, the ability to resolve and invent things. I got a guy in Santa Clara was able to jury rig me to a hardline phone that was from the 1960s. And I got a very slow thing. Now, things have really improved. Cubatel. But the government has total control over the internet. There's it's one provider, unless somebody has their own satellite at their house or on the roof. In the old days, people would just stick satellite dishes on their roof. But what I am hearing is that certainly among people who have been arrested, they're down. Certainly people who are suspected of being part of the protests, which are thousands of people, they don't have any internet. They've been cut off. I mean, we haven't heard a peep out of Tanya Bruguera for like 3 days, for instance. And she had very, very good internet because her mom, first of all, she was spending half her time Cuba, New York. So she had a lot of access. Her mother was actually born in Brooklyn. And she's well known, and she had funds coming from the United States, and she had and then, she was cut off. So let's say people like in Santiago de Cuba or little towns like Banas or Matanzas, well, Matanzas is not a little town. It's very, very dicey, but they have moved very aggressively to shut this down and stop. And remember, what was the language that was used? The first day, Miguel Diaz-Balart said, we need people to fight these people. We need the revolucionarios. In other words, if you're on the streets, you're anti-revolution. Now that's as bad as it gets in Cuba. Anti-revolution, that's bad. That would warrant what used to be called acto de repudios, acts, in other words, where, a citizen group could come and mete out punishment for you because you're anti-revolution. So he invoked that language and then sure enough, they did a government mandated demonstration that Raul Castro attended.
these protests seem to me to be fueled by WhatsApp and by TikTok. I mean, TikTok is just amazing what's going on in TikTok
Right.
about protests. So I'm wondering whether these are cellular services and not internet services, because I, during the whole time it was happening, I was getting feeds through those two services, and also there's Instagram and Facebook. But I would say TikTok really is the winner in terms of following or having people input information. Are you aware of what the Biden is trying to do with the balloons that he's trying to place them above Cuba for the internet? Do you know anything about that?
Well, he's getting pushback saying it's not going to really be successful. The technology people who know a lot more than me, that you need some kind of internet provider on the ground. And if Cubacell completely goes out of their way to block it, it could be just, money thrown away. On the other hand, he's going to get a lot of political points. My own 2 cents and my advice to the Biden administration would be this. Condemn the repression against protesters and the mass arrests, but send boats with food and thousands or millions of vaccines that we know are peer reviewed, and try to get the internet. In other words, you send 2 messages. We are standing with you, the people who are demonstrating. We acknowledge that you're hungry, that you're frightened of COVID, and that you've been cut off from communications. Yes, you're right about TikTok or WhatsApp, but one of the things we just learned is that WhatsApp is easily co-opted. Let's say, the whole NSO Israeli scandal has to do with that they were getting inside these encrypted programs, and human rights demonstrators were being arrested by the infiltration through WhatsApp. I got to assume that YouTube and TikTok can also be targeted. I think if the Cuban government puts their mind to it and they have a big cyber capability, there was a very famous general I knew, Ramon, I'm blanking on his name. He goes way back to the Sierra, and this was his bailiwick. And I'm sure he's figured this out.
Here's a question about Black Lives Matter. How could Black Lives Matter or other progressive Black groups provide a more nuanced critique of anti-democratic tendencies with the Cuban government, but also support the right to be a socialist nation? I think this is one of the key issues with the African-American community here in the U.S., that they really very much support the sort of the energy of Cuba to say no to the United States and be a sovereign nation. But there's the other side of the coin, which is the communist repression that's going on. So, I mean, how could the African-American community sort of balance the two and provide support to the Afro-Cuban community?
Well, they've got to do something because they've lost all credibility. And Black Lives Matter has to understand that Cuba today is a country where the majority are people of color. And when they condemn those protesters and put all the blame on the United States embargo, they're condemning Black people of color. They have lost all credibility. And they have really shot themselves in the foot. And I just don't think that their leadership understood the complexity of Cuba. Yes, there was a time when Cuba was, I want to say Maomeno, was 60% white, 40% Black or mixed race. For those of you who don't know, you can use words like mulatto or mestizo or una mezcla. In Cuba, those are not racially charged words. People use those words to describe who they are. They'll even say el negro. So the language itself, they don't even understand the language that is used in among Cuban blacks, which is very different than Americans. But they've lost really all credibility in Cuba, and they better reissue some statements and clarify that, because they're getting as demonized in South Florida. And people are furious. Even non-Cubans, like say Haitians, are like, what are you doing? They're rounding up black people and you're saying, oh, no big deal, really. So they have a lot of work to do in that regard, differentiating between socialism and communism. I don't think you have to go there. I think you just have to say, and first of all, if anybody who's been to Cuba understands about Cuban healthcare, I mean, I've been there for years. I've been there since 92. And I've had to go to the hospital. You bring your own aspirin, you bring your own antibiotics, you bring your own bandages. And if you go in the hospital, you bring your own sheets. So this idea that, oh, it's this great Cuban healthcare, and how can we talk about insulin? I watched a woman in Santiago de Cuba around 10 years ago literally die from lack of insulin.
I have another question or a comment about Black Cubans. How do we make sure that we protect Black Cubans? Question mark. White Cubans in South Florida are also the most racist and prejudiced. Can we trust anyone who wants to liberate Cuba? I would say probably not. And I think we have an issue in that a lot of the Cubans that the white Cuban community in the United States is prejudiced, and they a lot of people think that's the Cuban community, but the Cuban community is really the Black community, over 76% African diaspora people in Cuba. So I mean, I think there's a disconnect there between the Cubans that we see in the United States and the Cubans that are really living in Cuba, and I think that might be part of the issue.
I think specifically what you mean, Al, is who runs South Florida, and those are white Cuban American politicians. It's Francis Suarez. It's Maria Elvira Salazar. It's Carlos Jimenez. I mean, on and on and on. I'm sorry if these names don't meet, but these are power players in South Florida. Marco Rubio, who I've written about extensively in Politico. You may want to look at Marco Rubio's background. And they are white Cubans. They come from white Cuban families. And this has always been a problem in South Florida. I mean, this happened during Mariel. When Mariel, people showed up and they went, wow, not everybody's white. Oh my God. Well, as white elites left, or white middle class or white working class left, the population became darker and darker. And intermarriage is very, very common. I remember years ago in the 1990s, somebody saying, Annie, every Cuban has some Black blood in them. And that's probably true, going back to slavery or whatever, whether they were, looked Black or not, So it's, this is truly a country, but it was always ruled by the white elites. Of course, we all know that Fulgencio Batista was a mulatto. He was, I believe he was half Black or whatever. And he was the general, for those who don't know, who led a coup and installed himself. And by the way, he's a man of color. And he was one of the most corrupt rulers in the history of Latin America. Okay, it led to the Cuban Revolution. So I think Tanya Bruguera is exactly right. There is no ideology here. This is not a Black versus white issue. This is an issue about opportunity, about food, and about vaccines. That's what it's about. And it's unlikely the Biden administration had many options besides to do some sanctions today, and they probably will do some more targeting individuals, targeting the military, etc. But they're not going to invade. They're not going to do a blockade, whatever. In Cuba, of course, they called the embargo un bloqueo, which is not true. A blockade means no one gets to trade. And also they're opening up remittances. So you can now, you remember in the Trump administration, they shut down everything. The idea being, again, so the Trump administration, who took their cues from the hardliners, who, as you pointed out, are all white Cubans of a certain generation, or they're the children of white Cubans, like Francis Suarez's father, Javier. I covered his election against Joe Carollo back in the day. They're the children of these white Cuban families who left in the 60s. So there's a massive disconnect at both sides on both issues. And, there's a lot of hardline white Cubans who basically see themselves as the government in waiting. There's a piece I'm part of in The Guardian, which is about the various exile groups. And South Florida, to a large degree, has become headquarters for exile or governments in waiting. And some of them are just, they're waiting for their moment. And we all remember in 1994, which this moment in history is quite similar to, Jorge Mas Canosa. He was the head of the Cuban exile groups, the Cuban American National Foundation. He was always ready to return to Cuba to take over. Well, it will be very hard to send an older white Cuban man to the island these days, even if he had any support. I think those days are over.
There's something I think we should say also, that the revolution is run by white people. I mean, basically, it is another big issue, is that most of the powerful people in the revolution are white. So I see this as sort of the people of color of Cuba taking over their government, what's been happening over the last week. So I see that as a very positive thing. I have one other question. There's a lot of questions and a lot of comments. And I will
one last question.
Ask you all to come to our website and take a look at them as well. But here's a question. Put another way, what would you do if you were Joe Biden or Anthony Blinken? What would you do, Annie?
What I would do is I would condemn the violence against ordinary Cubans. I would demand the immediate release of everybody who has been rounded up for protesting. I would put out a list. I'd get involved with Amnesty International. We don't know how many people have been arrested. We just don't have numbers, but it's in the thousands, and it's all over the island. The other thing I would add, Al, from what you just said, is there is a myth in America that Cuba is a colorblind society. Racism is alive and well and always has been in Cuba and in every part of Latin America. And I remember when I first went down there in 92, you didn't see Black Cubans. There was one guy, Juan Almeida, and they would trot him out, and he was the one Black guy. Now they've made, and it was all men, by the way. Every single one was a white male. They have made strides in terms of there's white faces now and Black faces, but you are absolutely correct. The ruling elite of Cuba, the ones who make the big time decisions, are still old school, hardline, generally white guys. But this idea that, it's a colorblind society, again, this speaks to the idiocy of the Black Lives Matter. They kind of bought the propaganda that, we don't have racism, everything's equal here. It's not equal. For those of you who've been there for tourism, who go to places, let's say you even go to Varadero, you see who's working the hotels, okay? At every level, whether it's the waiter or the guy, the clerk checking you in, they're gonna mostly be white. Again, there have been some changes, but This is not a colorblind society. Black Lives Matter has made a terrible mistake. And I think what the Biden administration can do is emphasize humanitarian issues, which are, will help you with food, will help you with vaccines, and open up remittances and open up people to people contacts that don't, if you can, don't go through the Cuban military. And at the same time, really, the sanctions on people who are directly involved with leading these roundups, these arrests and everything. Listen, this is a moment in history. The genie will not go back in the bottle. This is a watershed moment. And the Biden administration, I think, knows that. But it's a delicate balance. They're looking at 2022. They're looking at 2024. I would tell them, don't get too excited. However, that said, they must do some basic things to speak to the Cuban people. Thank you.
Well, we've run through an hour and 15 minutes. I just want to remind people that getting COVID is not a black or white issue. It's not a socialist or capitalist issue.
Right.
It's a human issue. So that's why our company and me personally, as well as Sage, are really focusing on trying to bring syringes to Cuba so they can actually finish their vaccination campaign. We urge you all to join us and work with the global health partners. And it doesn't take a lot of money. It's whatever you can do, the more you can do, the better. But you can really impact a lot of people by just getting a needle in their arms, and then all of these issues will be resolved. I'm very excited about what's happening in Cuba. I think that the people of color all of a sudden are taking over the island, which is a very, very important thing for us, and that should be something that all African Americans should be behind and support, because I think it's going to be ultimately better for all of us. So, Annie, thank you so much for being here with us again. All of you that are here, we really are very happy that you joined us. And please stay tuned for some of our other conversations. And I think we're going to close now, unless there's a burning question out there. Anybody else? We're getting a lot of thank yous. Sage, you want to have the last word?
I don't have anything else to say. Thank you. I just hope that both our governments. I think there's a big problem in the U.S. government and in the Cuban government's approach, and I don't think everyone's trying to take sides. But I think what needs to happen is when you got hardliners on both sides who are in combat and the people aren't stuck in the middle. If you can, let go a little bit and just let people communicate and talk. Without so much antagonism, I think that's really what needs to happen. So,
there was a question: how many people joined us? We had 150 people online.
Wow!
Listening, and I'm sure you'll go back and talk to your family members and your friends. I mean, all of us talking about Cuba really is the most important thing right now. We can't let it get buried in the news.
Now, I'm going to tell people who are interested in the history. What happened in '94? What happened during Mariel? One of my first books was Cuba Confidential, was about Washington, Miami. You can get the history of what happened in '94, the origins of hardline Spanish language radio in Miami, and also without Fidel, sort of brings you up to, if you want to know the politics of how we got here, and you're just looking for a primer, they're both helpful in that regard.